There we go. Great. Hey everybody, this is Panama Bartholomew with the Building Decarbonization Coalition, and welcome monthly, sometimes twice a month, webinar series, Building Decarbonization Presents. And we have a fantastic lineup today. The health effects from gas stoves. We're really excited to be able to welcome in Niels and Andee Krasner from Rocky Mountain Institute about their brand new study that is sweeping the world. Research from over 40 years of work on looking at the health effects of gas. And so we're really excited about them. But let me tell you a little bit about the coalition, and then we'll get right into hearing from Andee and Brady. So the Building Decarbonization Coalition is a coalition of utilities and manufacturers, the design and construction community, local governments, and non-governmental organizations that all work together to try to find market solutions to eliminate emissions from the built environment. And here's many of our members up here on our screen. And we adopted that back in 2018, looking at California's buildings and how to eliminate emissions from California's buildings. In that roadmap, we called for a number of numerical targets to be met, that we have a zero emission building code for residential buildings by 2025 and for commercial by 2028, and that we bring about existing buildings policies that completely eliminate emissions by 2045, stepping down over time. A key part of that being that we are increasing the market share of sales of non-fossil fuel appliances, so that by 2030, we have 100% fossil fuel free appliances in the state. Critical goals, we outlined a number of critical overarching, more principled goals that are going to have to in order to be able to meet those numerical goals. Building awareness is a key part of it among basically all stakeholders, ensuring that customers and installers electrification compared to fossil fuels means are prepared, and we've gotten very policy to meet all of these other goals. And this webinar clearly sits within that first goal. And so this webinar series is one way to be able to bring life to these goals that we all adopted and take them from the page and actually put them into practice around California. And so this webinar series is our effort to bring in some of the national and really global leaders, thinkers, doers, within building decarbonization space to talk about some of the latest research, some of the latest work, some of the things that should really drive the industry forward. And Andee and Brady clearly rest within that community of some of the best thinkers and doers within this space. And so we're really excited to join them. Webinar logistics, into it, everyone's muted. We had about 250 organizations that registered today. We're gonna questions via chat, so please just submit them via chat, and then we'll ask the speaker at the end of the remarks. We might unmute you if we need some clarification. This webinar is being recorded, so please be responsible. And members of the coalition can access a recording of this at any point on our website. And if you become a member, you don't only get that benefit, but many other great benefits of being a member of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. It's an incredible value for low membership fees, high benefits, including being able to see all the recordings of all the different webinars that we've given. And so please check us out at buildingdecarb.org if you're interested. So with that, I'm going to ask Brady and Andee to please share their screen. And I will allow them to take over on the rest of the presentation. But we're very excited about this because the impacts of gas stoves on indoor air quality are a bigger and bigger and more important issue in building electrification, and is one of the largest drivers of activity building electrification. And so we're very excited to have the two in the space come and talk. Everybody at home, please, a big round of applause, BDC love for Andee and Brady as they walk us through this presentation. Over to you, Armai.
Thanks, Panama. It's great to be here and see some familiar names in the chat and some that I recognize from emails and Twitter feeds. So great to be here. Just a quick introduction. My name is Brady Seals. I'm a senior associate on Rocky Mountain Institute's Building Electrification Program, where we are also working to decarbonize the 70 million buildings in the US. Before coming to Rocky Mountain Institute, I worked for about 11 years internationally on clean cook stoves and household energy, working to help transition folks from wood and charcoal to cleaner alternatives. And as I like to say, completing the spectrum here at RMI with the move from gas to electric. So a diehard stover, if you will, and great to be here. And I'm going to turn it over to Andee, who was the other co-author of the report.
Good morning. My name is Andee Krasner. I'm the Program Manager for Climate and Health at Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I'm a proud volunteer with Mothers Out Front in 2 different capacities as part of the National Health Impacts team, as well as my local Boston team. And I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I know that this call is probably not your first or last Zoom call today, so we appreciate you joining us to talk about gas stoves. As I talk to you today, I'm wearing 2 hats, that of someone who works in public health and cares about health equity, but also as a parent who is responsible for looking out for my own children's safety and health. At the end of this presentation, we want you to have a better sense of how common indoor air pollution is, how gas stoves degrade indoor air quality, and that high levels of nitrogen dioxide can affect the health of children and other sensitive populations. Do you want to advance the slide? To help you with that goal, Brady and I are going to give you an overview of our joint report, and then we are going to talk a little bit about outdoor air quality. And we are going to do a little zoom in on California. Brady's going to talk about upcoming work, and then at the end we'll have time for questions and discussion. This report was made possible by an amazing collaboration between Rocky Mountain Institute, Sierra Club, Mothers Out Front, and Physicians for Social Responsibility. While Brady and I are here talking to you today, there was a whole team behind this report, and we just want to thank them for all the work that they did, and it was just a really great group to work with. So our report by the numbers, we have 8 key findings, 4 case studies of action, and then some practical recommendations for 4 types of decision makers. The 8 key findings are that indoor air pollution is unregulated in the United States. Gas stoves emit numerous pollutants, among which are particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, as well as volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde. Indoor air pollution can reach levels that would violate national and California ambient air standards. And there are well-documented health risks to high levels of nitrogen oxides, including increased rates of asthma and hospital admissions. Children are particularly at risk of respiratory illnesses from cooking with gas, and lower income households are more likely to have higher levels of indoor air pollution. Ventilation of gas stoves is important, but it can't be our sole strategy because of a number of limitations that I've seen this group discuss on email. So I know you guys are aware of those limitations. And electric cooking is the cleaner option. Next slide. So just to take a step back, we know that outdoor air pollution kills over 100,000 people a year in the United States, but as Americans, we spend only about 10% of our time outdoors. The vast majority of our time is spent indoors, 90%, with 65% of that being in our residences, and we probably expect with COVID that that is actually higher right now. So the EPA states that indoor pollutant levels may be 2 to 5 times and as much as 100 times higher than indoor rates than outdoor rates. So we have higher pollution rates inside our homes, where we spend the vast majority of our time. And while indoor air quality is affected by a number of different aspects, including smoking, pests like cockroaches and mice, humidity, mold, the type of heating in your home, how much ventilation you have, and what we're going to talk about today, the type of stove you cook on. So homes with gas stoves have 50 to 400% more nitrogen dioxide emissions than homes with electric stoves. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with nitrogen dioxide, it is a criteria pollutant covered by the US National Ambient Air Quality Standards under the Clean Air Act, and it is associated with a number of maladies, including respiratory illnesses like asthma. So how do we know that the pollutants are coming from the gas stoves? Everyday cooking produces a certain level of pollution, whether you're using a gas or an electric stove. And that comes in the form of particulate matter. And that is dependent mainly about what you're cooking with. If you're boiling water, there's very little particulate matter. However, if you're cooking with fats, you would have a lot more particulate matter, regardless of what type of stove you're using. And regardless of stove type you're using, you get particulate matter that's 10 microns, PM 2.5, which is 2.5 microns, and ultrafine particles. And just to give you a sense of what PM 2.5 is, it's smaller than the circumference of a strand of hair. So when you breathe it in, it gets lodged in your lungs, and it can inhibit your respiratory system from working very well. So when you cook with gas, you not only get a wider variety of air pollutants, you get them at higher concentrations. The byproducts of burning gas are PM 2.5, nitrogen oxides, also known as NOx, which include both nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide, which we're going to talk a lot about. It also has carbon monoxide and formaldehyde, as well as other volatile organic compounds. So cooking with gas produces a lot more PM 2.5 than electric stoves, and as you can see, a wider variety of pollutants. Next slide. Indoor nitrogen dioxide emissions from gas stoves often exceed outdoor standards. As you can see, the outdoor standards for nitrogen dioxide for a 1 hour average are 100 parts per billion, according to the US national standard. Canada's national standard is 60, and then the California state standard is actually 3 times that of Canada. And when we're talking about a part per billion, I always like to know what these sizes mean. It's about 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized pool. So these are very small amounts of nitrogen dioxide that we're talking about. In the United States, we don't regulate indoor air at all. Canada and the World Health Organization have issued indoor guidelines for nitrogen dioxide, and you can see that those are 90 and 106 parts per billion for a 1 hour average. And when you compare those to the measured nitrogen dioxide emissions for gas stoves at peak levels, which can range from about 100 parts per billion to 500 parts per billion, you can see that the peak levels are much higher than the 1 hour averages. And now those are not exactly comparable, but we have 2 studies that have modeled the 1 hour averages and found that cooking with there's a UCLA study that was out in 2020 that Brady's going to talk a little bit more about. But the UCLA study modeled 1 hour averages and found that cooking with gas stoves and baking for an hour exceeded both the EPA and California outdoor ambient air quality standards more than 90% of the time. And when you look at this specifically for California, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory found that cooking with gas is estimated to expose approximately 12 million Californians to certain pollutant levels that would exceed ambient air standards outdoors in a typical winter week. So here's what we know so far. Indoor air quality is generally worse than outdoor air quality. We spend a lot of time indoors, and gas cooking stoves contribute high levels of a known air pollutant, nitrogen dioxide. So how does that translate into health impacts or health effects? I want to first focus on children because they're more susceptible to illnesses associated with air pollutants than adults. Next slide. There are three main factors for why children are more susceptible to illnesses associated with air pollution than adults. The first is that they have higher breathing rates and greater levels of physical activity. They have a higher lung surface to body weight ratios and smaller bodies. And their respiratory and immune systems are still developing. So an adult and a child can breathe in the same concentration of nitrogen dioxide, but the child will actually experience that within their body at a higher level. So the health effects of nitrogen dioxide in children are many. Next slide. Nitrogen dioxide is known to aggravate respiratory illnesses, and it's also can increase the rates of childhood asthma, both current and lifetime. It increases, I'm actually trying to read the slide and it's so tiny I'm having trouble. It can make the airways more, I can't see the slide. Sorry guys, perhaps you can see it better than I can. But basically it causes a lot of problems in the respiratory system. It also has cardiovascular effects. And when children are exposed to nitrogen dioxide, it actually makes them more likely to have a reaction to allergens. And lastly, it's associated with learning deficits. Next slide. Oh, there's one more point I want to make with health effects of nitrogen dioxide. While there's well-established relationships between nitrogen dioxide, cooking with gas is also independently associated with increased risk of asthma. Cooking with gas has nitrogen dioxide in it, but it comes with a potpourri of co-pollutants, and we're not always sure how those co-pollutants like lead, formaldehyde, carbon monoxide react in the body when they are consumed by a child altogether. So there's a meta-analysis that found that cooking with gas increases children's risk of current asthma by 42%. So it's not just nitrogen dioxide. We know that cooking with gas independently also increases children's risk of asthma. Next slide. Periodically, the EPA does evaluations of different criteria pollutants, and this is the comparison of the 2008 and 2016 integrated science assessment for oxides of nitrogen. And what I want to point out to you is that they found that in short periods of nitrogen dioxide exposure has a causal relationship with respiratory disease, particularly asthma. And so they upgraded it from likely causal to causal. And longer exposures to elevated nitrogen dioxide is likely causal for respiratory effects, which includes asthma. So short-term and long-term nitrogen dioxide exposure is linked to clinically relevant increases in airway responsiveness, emergency department visits, and hospital admissions for asthma, as well as the development of asthma. So it increases the incidence of asthma, which is important because we're going to talk about this with respect to California. The EPA ISA concludes that people with asthma, children, and older adults, those who are 65 years and older, are at increased risk of NO2-related health effects. So let's take a look at pediatric asthma burden in California. So asthma is the #1 chronic disease in children, and in California, the prevalence of asthma is nearly twice that at the national rate. It's 15%. 15% means that more than 1 in 7 children in California have an asthma diagnosis, and you can see in these dark blue counties that the burden is actually as high as 1 in 4 kids with asthma. So we know that a lot of people in California cook with gas stoves. According to the American Housing Survey, which surveyed over 13,000 Californians, 2/3 of people cook with a gas stove in California, which is twice the national average. So we know that gas stoves contribute very high levels of nitrogen dioxide. And so we can assume that there's a high level of indoor nitrogen dioxide exposure. It's certainly not the only exposure, and it's not the only cause of asthma, but because both the exposure and the disease are widespread, reducing air pollution could have a significant public health impact. We know from a very well-designed prospective study that was done in Los Angeles that when you reduce nitrogen dioxide, you actually reduce asthma incidence. Researchers found for each 4.3 parts per billion decrease in nitrogen dioxide, there was a reduction in 8.3 cases per 1,000 person years. So I just want to put that in perspective. We were looking at peak rates of using the gas stove as 100 to 500 parts per billion. And yet when you reduce the exposure by 4.3 parts per billion, you start to see a decrease in incidence in asthma. So it's just a small amount of nitrogen dioxide that can make a big difference. The other point I want to make is that with this information is that in California, there are a lot more children who are susceptible to the health effects of nitrogen dioxide than what is considered protective of the general population. So where the EPA annual standard of ambient nitrogen dioxide is 53 parts per billion, sorry with all these numbers, I know it gets confusing, but children with an asthma diagnosis can start to have aggravated asthma at concentrations as low as 11 parts per billion. And for every 5 parts per billion increase, their symptoms get worse at a dose response. We also know from a meta-analysis done as far back as the 1990s that risk of respiratory illnesses goes up by about 20% with every 15 parts per billion of nitrogen dioxide. So if we can reduce nitrogen dioxide exposure in people's homes, we can make a difference in the incidence of asthma, as well as a difference in the experience of children who have an asthma diagnosis already. Next slide. So we are going to change topics from nitrogen dioxide to carbon monoxide. And we're going to talk about the health effects of carbon monoxide and look at those in comparison to alarm thresholds. Basically, this table shows that people are likely to experience symptoms from carbon monoxide exposure before a detector will actually sound an alarm. And the EPA stated that there's likely to be a causal relationship between short-term carbon monoxide exposure and cardiovascular morbidity. People with coronary heart disease are more vulnerable to low levels of carbon monoxide exposure and are likely to have a higher number of hospital admissions if they're exposed to carbon monoxide. Next slide. So lower income households are at higher risk of being exposed to high levels of gas stove pollution. And this is really a health equity issue. We have evidence that when you live in a smaller household, then your exposure to nitrogen dioxide is higher. So smaller unit size, more people in the home, and older homes actually make it more likely that you're going to be exposed to nitrogen dioxide. The reason that older homes have higher levels of nitrogen dioxide is because the stoves may not be properly adjusted and they may have a flue. So the old stoves with the flue have very high levels of nitrogen dioxide because the gas is burning 24 hours a day. Older homes may have inadequate ventilation. They may not have over the stove hood so that's vented to the outdoors. And because people in lower income households are more likely to rent, they're not going to have control over these things. They've got to depend on their landlords to make those changes. Lower income households are also more likely to use a stove or oven for supplemental heat. This is true both in Baltimore as well as in California. And lower income households are more likely to be exposed to higher levels of outdoor pollution. So that outdoor pollution does come into a home. And so they have just higher base exposure to both indoor and outdoor pollution. And like we just discussed, the lower income households have a greater asthma burden. So when exposed to nitrogen dioxide in the home, they will react to it at much lower levels. Next slide. So we do know that transitioning from gas stoves to electric options can yield health benefits. A study of 2 public housing apartment buildings here in Boston found that there were improved health impacts when people moved from traditional housing to green housing. They switched from gas to electric stoves. And the authors felt that this could be a contributor of the evidence reductions, not only in nitrogen dioxide, but in PM 2.5, because the cooking times did not change. And so they saw actually a reduction of nearly 47% fewer sick building syndrome symptoms in those buildings. Next slide. So what can individuals do to make their homes healthier? The first thing you should do is install and maintain a carbon monoxide detector. It won't actually reduce pollution, but it will let you know if carbon monoxide levels are dangerously high. If you are cooking, you can turn on your over the stove range hood. Using an externally vented range hood when you cook has shown to be effective in not only reducing the air pollution, but also reducing respiratory symptoms in children. In fact, though, many range hoods are not vented to the outdoors. Mine is not, the range hood I have in my house is not vented to the outdoors. I found that out as I was doing research into this. And if they're not vented to the outdoors, they just recirculate the air pollution while being very noisy. I just want to make the point that all your other gas appliances, your HVAC system, your water heater and dryers are all required to be externally vented to the outdoors, but not your gas stove. And your gas stove is in the gathering place of your home. It's in the kitchen. It's not in a basement or a garage. It's central to your home. So people are exposed to high levels of nitrogen dioxide while people are cooking. If you don't have a vented range hood, you can turn on other ventilation. That might be mechanical ventilation in your kitchen. You can turn on a fan, or you can open a window, which can help reduce indoor air pollution too. I live in Boston. We don't typically open windows in winter, and I've got friends in Miami who say they would never open a window in summer. So, you know, that's not always an option for people to open a window because of weather or safety, or the windows just physically don't open. If that's the case, you can reduce air pollution by minimizing the use of your stove by using electric appliances, like a kettle for boiling water. You can also try an induction plug-in stove, which costs about $50, and those come in single or double burners. And actually, we actually used one for about 3 weeks during COVID. So they work very well. While we are advocating for people to use ventilation, if they have it, we know that most people don't use it because they forget or it's too noisy. I know I've never wanted to use mine because I want to know what the kids are doing in the other room. The most effective way to reduce pollution from gas stove is actually to switch out the source of the pollution. As homes become more and more energy efficient, reducing air pollution is even more important because there's less natural exchange of air. So the next time you're shopping for a new stove, consider an electric or an induction stovetop instead. And that will eliminate the pollutants produced from burning gas, which we've talked about: nitrogen dioxide, PM 2.5, carbon monoxide. And induction stoves are as precise and fast as gas stoves and more efficient. So before I end, I just want to recognize that the burden of environmental pollutants is disproportionately borne by low-income communities and communities of color. And environmental justice communities are more likely to be exposed both to outdoor and indoor air pollution for structural reasons. And they are more likely to suffer from the effects of air pollution, including asthma and heart disease. The responsibility for addressing existing health disparities from air pollution can't be left solely to individual action alone. So while there are things you can do in your individual kitchen, we really need to adopt policies that make sure that we have equitable health outcomes. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brady, who's going to talk about some of our recommendations.
Thanks, Andee. You know, as Andee and I and the others were looking into this report, we looked at nearly 50 years of health and scientific evidence, and we did a deep dive in the last 20 years. And, you know, some of it was expecting the shoe to drop. Like, when were we going to find out that this wasn't so bad, that this wasn't such of a big deal? If these health issues are so clear, why is it that we don't know more and more hasn't been done? And it was really the opposite. Every expert we talked to, every study we read just seemed to corroborate what we were finding. And in fact, the evidence has been strengthening. So I think some of our best thinking was on recommendations for policymakers. We also had recommendations for individuals, as Andee talked about, and for researchers and funders. But policymakers have the ability to move the needle on this issue. And I think given the state of the world and COVID and the stay-at-home orders and the links between air quality, there is really no time like the present to take action. So we put together a few different steps, and I wanted to quickly touch on a few of these. The first is, as you can remember from the graphic comparing baking a cake with 230 parts per billion to the outdoor guidelines, we don't have the right benchmarks. We don't have indoor air quality guidelines at a national level, and states like California that do have some guidelines are outdated and unenforced. And so without guidelines that tell us what are safe levels for indoor air, it's very hard to implement good building codes that ensure that our appliances are reaching these. And so this is top of mind as California is going through its 2022 building code, and we've been very active in making comments and speaking to some of the folks involved in this process. But number one, we need to be using benchmarks that we know can safeguard health. And I think this is a really good first step that can flow into ensuring that we are protecting the most vulnerable, which is children, lower income households, etc. So building codes has a really key way to play in this. And the other piece is warning labels. You know, we don't know often that something that many of us have, and in California, perhaps twice as many, 70% of Californians who cook with gas have this stove. So we need to do more consumer education, and I think some sort of a warning label would be an effective means. The other piece is that we need incentives. So these could be in the form of tax credits or rebates, and they should be made available for plug-in induction stoves or for switching to electric. And I really have to commend California on this. We've seen some fabulous stove lender programs from Sacramento and Silicon Valley where you can try out a plug-in induction stove and for 3 weeks for free to see if you like it. I think there's some misinformation out there about induction and, you know, will your pots work on it? You can also put magnets on the bottom of your pots and see if they stick. And if they do, you know that your cookware is compatible. But this is a really good way, an entry point to breaking down the barriers and the questions to what is induction. One of the trickier things is this lower income household. What do we do with people who rent and can't make that financial commitment up front to switch out a stove or don't have the power because they rent? And so we really have to start with our public buildings and using our funds to ensure that schools and low income housings and others are not able to purchase or install appliances that have a known health risk. So I think another piece of this, again, is the education requiring disclosures, etc. So we have more detailed recommendations in the report, but here are some buckets at a higher level. Just to switch gears and talk about what happened after we published this report, which was on May 5th, World Asthma Day. To be honest, we weren't sure what the reception was going to be. And I think it really floored us. The report was featured in over 150 original articles and reprinted stories. And this spanned the spectrum from the Daily Mail, Fox News, to Vox and Bloomberg, Politico. And we're still seeing some hits come out about this. And I think this was part of our intent to bring this top of mind, but let's not let it stop here, because we know what has to happen and how do we create action from some of this information. So even for Rocky Mountain Institute, this has been the most visited page on the website this year, besides the open job posting. So just, I think, wanting to really hammer home that this is something important, and I think something that we have opportunities to make a real change on. And this I had to include because of the fun graphic, but Mother Jones also did a story about the gas industry paying influencers to talk about gas stoves. And I think for me, one of the most interesting pieces about this was after this story came out, a lot of these influencers removed their postings that were paid for, sponsored by the gas industry. And part of that was because everyday readers and folks were commenting on these posts. And, you know, really, I think part of it is just a lot of people aren't aware. Look, I've worked on stoves for 11 years and only recently realized what a big deal some of the nitrogen dioxide and other impacts are. So I think there's a piece of this that is moving into the public awareness, and then how do we take the policy action? So I know this is a presentation about indoor air and gas stoves. I recently read somewhere that we spend more time in buildings than some whales spend underwater, meaning that some whales are coming up for air more often than we're leaving our buildings. But since we've co-opted, I wanted to share a few words on outdoor air pollution, since we didn't have the space in this report. This is a slide that we call the bubble slide very affectionately, and this is where we found out that in California, and this slide looks similar in other states, but burning fossil fuels in our buildings, so generally our fuel appliances in our buildings, generally generates nearly as much nitrogen oxides as all of the light-duty passenger vehicles in California. And so that's nearly 6 times more than power plants. So outdoors, the gas appliance that we have that are vented is causing the same kind of NOx that Andee just talked about with the health risks. So this is an indoor issue, but it's also an outdoor issue. But the good news is that by tackling gas in buildings, we're tackling NOx. And NOx is a precursor emission to both ozone or smog and secondary particulate matter, often called soot. And so NOx reacts and turns into other pollutants. So if you're able to address NOx at the source, you're also addressing ozone and PM, which are some of the most damaging pollutants for human health. This is data from a recent MIT study that came out in February, which looked at cross-state pollution. The pollution we produce in California does not stay in California. The pollution produced in Nevada does not stay in Nevada, but we're all really in this together. So the top line message of this report was the cross-state pollution impacts. But the other part of this report that was really fascinating was, due to regulation in most of the other polluting sectors like transport, power generation, and industry, generally there has been decreases. However, the building sector has been increasing across all states, and in California, the building sector is responsible for over 6,000 premature deaths per year. And this does include wood and gas, but I think this shows that without strong regulation, it's very likely to imagine in states that are growing and adding new gas customers that this number will increase. So let's zoom in a bit on California. This is a UCLA report that was published at the end of April that Andee mentioned with Sierra Club. And in this, they looked at all of the gas appliances in our homes. And you can see the chart on the left that water heaters, the blue, and heating or furnaces and boilers, the red, are a larger share of NOx emissions as compared to cooking or stoves and oven, which is the yellow. And so yes, that cooking is is a smaller portion of the emissions that get vented outdoors, but indoors it has a disproportionate impact. And we know that to tackle the overall building emissions, we do need to address the stove. It is the appliance that people feel emotionally invested in. I personally feel like once you learn and read this information, it's very hard to unsee the invisible pollution that's been happening all along. But I think it just goes to show that this is a smaller amount from emission source, but indoors, it really does have a disproportionate effort. And the UCLA report looked at if all of our appliances are vented outdoors, if we replace those appliances with clean electric alternatives, we would save over 350 lives annually, avoiding around 900 cases of respiratory illnesses. So imagine this is not taking into account indoor air pollution. So imagine what those numbers would be if we could accurately quantify the health savings indoors. This looks similar to the chart that Andee showed you, but I just wanted to say that California, unlike many states, has been looking at indoor air pollution, and the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, set indoor air quality guidelines in 1994. So there's a precedent. We have these guidelines, but they are outdated and unenforced, and so our message is that it's high time to take a look at these. We have the experts who are interested in helping and sharing to figure out what is the health protective level of nitrogen dioxide that we should be having indoors. Canada took really strong action in 2015 and set both indoor air quality guidelines and also an outdoor NO2 that is now the strictest in the world. And so I think we can learn from our neighbors to the north. This goes back to what I'm saying. There's a lot of numbers on this slide, but just wanted to say, Andee talked about the asthma incidence in California, and it costs about $11 billion a year to pay for the asthma burden in California. In the US, it's $80 billion. So this is a huge burden, a financial burden as well as a health burden. And we do know that gas stoves are a main trigger. We don't know how much asthma or how much burden the gas stoves are producing, but just to give you an idea, in Australia in 2018, they looked at the childhood asthma burden, children under 14, and found that 12.3% of the population level data was attributed to the gas stove. And so Australia has a similar population size as California. So we don't have these numbers for California or for the US yet, but I think that isolating the gas stoves and the high concentrations of NO2 as a trigger would be a very interesting exercise, and I think we would learn a lot. Again, this $3.5 billion in healthcare costs every year, this is from the UCLA saying if we changed out all the appliances with electric alternatives that vent outdoors, we would save $3.5 billion every year. And then on a personal note, it costs over $3,000 a year if you have asthma or someone in your household has asthma. So right now, the cost of an electric stove being $500 to $100, and this is expensive, and we recognize this, and we do think this needs to come down and can come down. But when you compare it to what the asthma costs are, there is certainly a return on investment for addressing this early when we can still prevent one of these known triggers. So this is my last slide, just to let you know that we have a really fantastic study that's been in the work for about a year from Harvard coming up in September that will be peer reviewed, that is going to look at what is the health cost of buildings versus coal emissions. And this is going to quantify and give us these numbers to really make the case for buildings and look at how coal, which has been in decline, has really changed and how buildings are taking up a higher share. So look out for that one. And then just to say, in California, we're really active with a number of partners. I'm sure some of you on this call on looking at the indoor air quality guidelines, suggesting a workshop where we bring in the experts to see how we can revise these. Like I said, these are guidelines, not standards and not binding, but without them, we are flying blind with how we design our buildings, what appliances we promote. And so we see this as a really critical step. And we know that when California makes a ambitious or bold move, as we just saw with the NOx truck standard, other states will follow. I think I saw that 17 states have adopted California's stricter tailpipe emissions. So imagine what we could start with buildings. I really think that California is the first domino to fall. And in some of my work in other states, they're looking to California. So this is just a few things on our radar. And with that, I just want to thank you for spending your morning with us, and we'll open it up for questions.
Wonderful. This is Panama from the Building Decarbonization Coalition again, and thank you both, Brady and Andee from Rocky Mountain Institute and Physicians for Social Responsibility, for that presentation. Great presentation. There's a lot of love for you guys in the chat. People are really excited about it. So let's get right into the questions because we got a lot of them. Well, first one being, what do the manufacturers say about this? And have you all talked to the manufacturers of the stoves about these risks, and where are they at on this issue?
As Physicians for Social Responsibility, we have not talked to them. Brady, has Rocky Mountain Institute been engaged with them?
I was going to say, Panama, this might be a question for you. You know, in general, I think that we haven't gone to the manufacturers. We've been really focused on policymakers at all different levels, policymakers, and doing more education. But Panama, if you have an answer to this question or any thoughts, I would be very eager to hear them.
Yeah, this is an area where the manufacturers have been largely silent. It's interesting because this is an area where, like water heaters and furnaces, the manufacturers of gas stoves are also the manufacturers of electric stoves, of the alternatives. And so unlike in a lot of situations where we're looking for a transition off of fossil fuels, we may have more of a partner in this than some other incumbent technology manufacturers. So an opportunity there. A question of, 63% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover a $500 emergency. What do you recommend those that can't afford converting to an electric stove?
It's a really good option. And I think that the slide that Andee said, let's start right now. There are things that we can do today that cost nothing that can reduce our exposure. So not eliminate, but reduce. And these are the cooking on the back burners where there usually is more ventilation, using ventilation, even if it's just the microwave model that recirculates it back into the kitchen like mine, opening up a window. And then, you know, people at RMI, my coworkers, many of whom who have gas stoves and live in small apartments in New York, have bought these portable plug-ins and just have placed it on top of their gas stove and are using that as a way to start. So I do know that's $50 or something around that range versus more. But I think that we are driving on the policy side that there needs to be incentives, there needs to be rebates, there needs to be these public funds for health and climate reasons that can really address those who pay the most on energy already. I mean, I've worked on energy burden around the world for the last 11 years, and it's so shocking how this country really isn't all that different, where those who have the least to pay often pay the most on energy, and I really recognize that, and that's why we are focusing a lot of our efforts on policymakers.
Great. There's a number of questions about ventilation, and if you could talk a little bit more about how ventilation actually helps in this case and what are the challenges of ventilation. And in particular, one person asked, how does cooking on the back burners help? But could you largely go over the opportunity there for ventilation and specifically to the back burners?
Sure. Ventilation does work at reducing nitrogen dioxide, and it's also been shown to reduce respiratory illnesses in children. So it not only reduces the nitrogen dioxide, but it does have a health effect. The problem with ventilation is that there's some limitations. First of all, you first have to have a vent that is vented out to the outdoors. If it's just recirculating the air, like a lot of ventilation does, it's not really helping. It's not taking the pollutants and moving them to the outdoors. The reason we suggest cooking on the back burners is because the capture rate is actually higher on the back burners, and so more of the pollution is going to be vented outdoors if you're cooking on the back burners. The other thing about ventilation is that people don't like the sound of it. It's noisy and people don't turn it on. And the information that we have is that, about 30% of people actually use ventilation on a regular basis. So they're not turning it on, and it can't work unless you turn it on.
Great, thank you. And I think it was earlier stated also that at least in California, we've only required ventilation in homes since about 2008. And many people live in homes with either without ventilation or poor ventilation. And if you live in one of those homes, particularly in a smaller space, it's harder to disperse those pollutants. And so it's an even bigger danger for folks who can't afford to move into a space with ventilation. How about climate change? What's the relationship between gas stoves and climate change?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We had wanted to put a lot into this report, but we also wanted to send it to our moms, and so they would read it. That was a big driver. So it's really only 10 pages of text and a lot of graphics and photos, but I think the climate change impacts are really critical. One of the things that we've been finding most interesting at Rocky Mountain Institute is looking at the cost of building and maintaining gas pipelines. And so the slide where I showed you from UCLA, where cooking is a smaller contributor to outdoor pollutants and a smaller contributor to greenhouse gas pollutants, but it is the reason of the gas stove is why pipelines still go into many homes. So in a lot of these all electric regulations that are coming into play, if you have an exception for the gas stove, you're still building the pipeline, which can be incredibly expensive to both build and maintain. And so I think that it's sort of a macro and a micro answer to the question of it's smaller on the emissions, but it has this issue of pipelines being built to feed the gas stoves, which of course is a great climate change. So I would be happy if there's more specifics to see if we could address that in a two-pager or an insight brief, if that's of interest.
Great. More questions coming in. Do you have info on the formaldehyde contents from cooking with gas, as was stated in the presentation? What is a level that we should be keeping formaldehyde emissions under for health impacts?
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly the level. I can just say that in the studies that we looked at for children, the formaldehyde levels coming from gas stoves were not high enough to have a measurable effect in the studies that we looked at. But we have to remember that when you cook with a gas stove, you're not just getting the formaldehyde, you're getting what I would say a potpourri of pollutants. So we don't know exactly how all of those are acting together. The other thing is formaldehyde is carcinogenic, and it takes a longer time for people to see cancer rates go up. So we just really don't know how that's affecting health in the very long term.
Just to add on to Andee's point, for those who are involved in the cook stove world and the research, and I saw Josiah on here earlier, but there has not been a lot of attention paid to other pollutants besides particulate matter for a very long time. I think nitrogen dioxide is starting to have its day with the increased causal relationship designation, although these pollutants have been there for a long time. And so I think formaldehyde is even lower on that list, but it's really a critical pollutant to measure. Some early studies that we have show that if you are cooking on a low setting for a long amount of time, like simmering a crock pot or a Dutch oven or something like that, you can get a higher buildup of formaldehyde. And so I think that this is where we've tried to identify gaps in the research and where it would be really nice to have some more literature and some more attention being paid. And I know folks from the research community are hungry for this information. And so I think that there's still a lot more we're going to learn about formaldehyde and other pollutants.
Great. What else do policymakers say they need in order to set policies or regulations for gas stoves? You know, what's needed to overcome the opposition voices to regulations like that?
I can start, and Andee, feel free to add in. It is a fascinating question. It is a black hole. When it comes to stoves and also just indoor air pollution, it is a regulatory black hole. In fact, some people don't even know whose responsibility it is to regulate it. And so part of our challenge, I'm thinking of New York, for example, is to figure out who would be responsible for doing this. In the US, indoor air is not regulated, unlike outdoor air. So thank goodness in California, we have CARB and others who already have a precedent of setting indoor air quality guidelines. And then we believe it's the responsibility of CARB and the California Energy Commission to do some work on this together, because building codes and this Title 24 process right now in California is a great example of this. We need current evidence that's brought forward from many folks. We need buy-in from the health community, the environmental community, the builders, the real estate, and I think California is really ground zero for this. I think one, there's just an educational element of trying to get the information out there in the right way. There's also a cost element. We just don't have the data on the indoor air the way we do outdoors, which makes it hard to do modeling, which then could turn into things like subsidies and incentives. So that's another area where we've heard from policymakers, can we figure out what this burden is and what it costs and what would be the cost for my jurisdiction for changing? And so I think that's an area where we would like to do a little bit more so that policymakers have the information they need to make these kind of cost benefits. But just big thing to say that indoor air is shockingly not an easy answer, and it really varies state to state.
Great, thank you. We're coming towards the end, and a number of people have complimented both of you on the presentation and the narration. They want to get a copy of the presentation and the slides. We are recording this, and it is available to members of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. Organizations, nonprofit organizations can join for free, but buildingdecarb.org/join is a way to see about becoming a member. You can have access to this excellent webinar and many other webinars. So that's the best way, and I'll post that again in the chat. Last question, commercial kitchens. Is there a lot of data on, or where can we find data on commercial kitchens and commercial kitchens' contributions to outdoor pollution? And what's their role in all this?
We will have a little bit on commercial kitchens in the Harvard study that will be released in September. So look there first. RMI will be doing some additional analysis on top of that study. It's really detailed and has a lot of data sets. And so that is one area. And I also want to say another interest is to look at unvented heaters and other things in schools. So I think looking more into these commercial spaces is a really key area where, once again, we just need a synthesis of what's out there and some analysis of what needs to happen to change the baseline.
Wonderful. Any last remarks, Andee or Brady?
I just thank everybody for joining, and these are wonderful questions and it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to talk with you today.
Just to reiterate, thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot to us, and would love to get these questions from folks, because Andee and I are trying to figure out what we do next. So would love your input on what information would be most useful. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you both, and thank everybody for joining us on this latest BDC Presents webinar series. And we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar series. Keep up the good work out there, everybody. Bye-bye.